Okay, let me just pray first as we get started. Father, thank you that we could all make it here again this evening. We pray that you'd be with us today as we continue thinking about apologetics, both for our sake and for the sake of those that we could share the gospel with. We pray that tonight would be challenging and encouraging, and that it would be a fruitful time together as we think about how to defend our faith in you. We pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so today we're thinking about positive apologetics. If you remember from last week, I introduced this distinction between two kind of branches of apologetics. There was positive apologetics, where we give reasons for believing in Christianity, and negative apologetics, where we give reasons for not thinking that Christianity is not true. The nots are why we call it negative apologetics. So we're focusing on the positive part tonight. Then in the next 2 weeks, we're going to be looking at negative apologetics. So next week will be suffering. I've been doing a lot of reading about suffering, so I'm sure that's going to be great. And then the week after that, we're just going to deal with a bunch of common objections. And then the week following that, we're going to answer the questions that you guys are writing down now on your piece, or throughout these sessions on those pieces of paper, or on the QR code when I get that working again next week. So that I figured that's for those of you who weren't. Was everyone here last week already? Yeah, cool. Okay, so you know what the questions are going to be for in the last session. Okay, so. Positive apologetics. Can anyone give me some examples of positive apologetics? No? No one can give me an example? You don't have to give me like an argument, but you can just tell me what the argument or thing would be that you're defending.
It can be anything like the reliability of the New Testament.
The reliability of the New Testament, that would be a great example. Or even of the Old Testament, right? You gotta, What else? The existence of? Everything. Okay, yeah, everything. Or more specifically, God, I guess? Or what do you mean everything? Everything in the Bible?
Or things exist, so we must have had it.
So that would be one of the arguments that you would give for the existence of God or something as the basis for believing, yeah. You could also talk about the defense of the resurrection. You could talk about the defense of particular doctrines, like maybe ethical stances of Christianity. Those would all be cases of thinking about positive apologetics. You'll remember last week we spoke a bit about how we might break up the Christian worldview as we think about defending it, so we can, think about defending individual parts of it rather than defending the whole thing in one go, because that can be quite a daunting prospect to think about. So one of the ways that we divided it up was through this grid here that I have. So theism is the basic idea that something like God exists, a creator exists. Religion adds to that the idea that we can act rightly or wrongly with respect to this God, so we can make him angry, we can make him happy, he cares about the way that we act. Then we had bare Christianity, which was sort of the absolute bare minimum that you would need to believe in order to be a Christian. This is also sometimes called mere Christianity, or it goes by, in Christian circles we often talk about salvation issues versus non-salvation issues, which has its basis in passages like Romans 14. And then we have fully clothed Christianity, which is sort of the full body of Christian beliefs that one might believe. So we might start out as a bare Christian, but very soon after that, we're going to have to figure out how we think about all these other things that are common in Christianity. And that's when we become a fully clothed Christian. C.S. Lewis, actually, he gave an example when he spoke about mere Christianity. He said mere Christianity is like the corridor in a house that leads into all these different rooms. And mere Christianity is about getting you into the corridor, but really the ultimate goal is for you to go and find one of those rooms to live in, right? Which are the fully fleshed out Christianity. So we'll come back to this distinction when we get to the second part of today's lesson. Generally speaking, when we're thinking about the first two of these, theism and religion, we're engaged in something called natural theology. Okay, so natural theology is theology based on what we can learn about God from nature. Right, so theology involving God, natural, nature. That's the basic idea. So here we're looking at arguments for God's existence. Maybe we're looking at the importance of religion or religion's social value or anything like that we can use. We're often drawing from science or philosophy or sociology or any sorts of things. And a lot of what we do in natural theology actually is shared with other religions. So the argument that we're going to look at tonight in natural theology was originally devised by Muslims. But they believe in a God and a creator of everything who's all-powerful and all these sorts of things that we would describe, and so too we do. There have been examples of Jewish natural theology, Buddhist natural theology, although Buddhist is a bit of a weird one, but and so on. So we share natural theology with anyone that is interested in the existence of God or the importance of religion. The next two layers, however, are unique to Christianity, right? So that's where we start to distinguish between, say, Islam or Judaism and Christianity specifically. That's when you're becoming a bare Christian. And here we're looking at things like Jesus' self-understanding, his death and the historicity of his death and resurrection, the general historical reliability of the Gospels, the reliability and the transmission of the New Testament and the Bible generally to us today, Christian doctrines like the Trinity and the Incarnation, like are those coherent? Do they make logical sense? Are there good reasons to believe them? And then also Christian ethics, as I've mentioned. So the second two layers we call Christian evidences, and they are what differentiate Christianity from other religions, right? So natural theology in common with other religions, although there might be a uniquely Christian way of doing natural theology, that's fine, but it's generally an enterprise that all religious people, all religions could engage in. And then Christian evidences are specifically like picking Christianity out of the panoply of religions that one might believe that's consistent with natural theology. Okay, so today the plan is to go through an example of each of these, right? So for natural theology, we're going to go through an example, a defense of God's existence. So that's going to be the theism box. In Christian evidences, we're going to look at an historical defense of the resurrection, and that's going to be the bare Christianity box. Okay, so obviously we can't get through everything, but to give you an idea, you don't have to remember everything we talk about. In fact, I would rather you just listen and engage with what we're talking about, and then buy this book later. It's called On God by William Lane Craig. It covers both the argument from the argument for God's existence that we're going to cover tonight, and the argument for Jesus' self-understanding and resurrection, as well as a whole bunch of other stuff in it. It's very accessible. It's designed for students who are first thinking about defending their faith. And he's a world-renowned philosopher, theologian, so he knows what he's talking about. I would highly recommend it. If you want to take a look at it afterwards, you are absolutely welcome to. And you can kind of see the kind of stuff that he covers and how he does it and so on. But I would highly recommend it as maybe a first book in apologetics that you get, because it's got a really good, well-rounded, he's even got a section on suffering and, a whole bunch of stuff. So really good book to get you into this stuff. Okay, so thinking about arguments for God's existence, there are lots of arguments for God's existence. Maybe we don't know that, but pretty much as long as human beings have been thinking about nature, they've been coming up with arguments for God's existence. You might not know this, but Aristotle, for instance, he was not a Christian, he was a Greek philosopher. He has an argument for God's existence that is really good and still defended today, which you might think is a bit weird because he was Greek, but the philosophers didn't really agree with the sort of polytheistic outlook of the masses in Greek culture. So not just from religions that we would recognize today, but even Greek philosophers have been arguing for God's existence for as long as they can. There's actually a cool book that I have here as well that you're welcome to look at. A while ago, a philosopher of religion called Alvin Plantinga gave a talk called 24 or so Arguments for God's Existence. And then recently, a bunch of philosophers from all over the world came together in a conference, and each one picked one of the arguments that he summarized in his talk, and they gave like a fleshed out defense of it, and then those were collected into this volume. So very cool. If you're interested in arguments for God's existence, I would highly recommend this as well, just to see sort of how different these different arguments can be and how one might go about defending them and all that sort of stuff. We're just going to go through one, as I said. So we're going to go through the first one, the top left there. It's called the Kalam cosmological argument. It's called that because it came from the Kalam school of theology. Kalam is a Muslim word. I don't actually know what it means. It originally arose with Muslims in, I think, early medieval times. I personally don't think it's the strongest argument for God's existence. I think it's a decent argument. I think it's good for illustration. And a lot of the other arguments, if I had to go through it, I wouldn't be able to get through it and other material in one lesson. I think it's also really good for illustrating how you could break down an argument and the different sorts of evidence that you could give for pieces of the argument. So it's a really good exercise, although it's still strong. Like I still use it when talking to people. So it's not like a dummy argument that you would throw away. So yeah, so this is what it looks like, nice and simple. Although, as you'll see with these sorts of arguments, simplicity can be a bit misleading. So it states, it's got two premises, which are sort of assumptions or claims that we need to defend, and then a conclusion, which follows from the premises logically, right? So whatever begins to exist has a cause. That's the first premise. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Now, let me just make some clarifications here. When I say cause here, I mean something that brings another thing into existence. I don't mean a purpose. Okay, I don't mean, like we did that for a good cause. I'm not using it in that sense. I'm using it in the sense of the fire caused the water to boil. That's the sense of cause that I'm using here. So that's the first thing to clarify. Now, there's lots of different ways that we could defend each of these. Our job as the apologist, or as the defender of God's existence, is to give reasons for believing the first and the second thing. As a comment on what I said last week, with regards to, you only kind of need to argue with someone on things that they don't agree with already. So if you already are talking to someone that believes that the universe began to exist, you don't really need to defend the claim that the universe began to exist. You kind of just have to help them connect the dots, and then they can come to believe that God exists. In fact, I remember speaking to a friend. I was at university, and he already believed that without God, you can't have objective morals, and that we do have objective morals. But he never put the two together and realized, oh, well, that means God must exist. So all I had to do was sit there and be like, but you understand that if you believe that thing and that thing, then the existence of God follows. And he said, oh, wow. And he's a smart guy. He was one of the smartest guys in our class. But people don't always connect the dots, right? They're not asking theological questions, and so they don't always necessarily expect a theological outcome. But in this case, let's assume that the person that we're talking to never really thought about any of this, and so we want to kind of take them through reasons why you might believe either of the first. These are not the only reasons you might give for these premises. They just are reasons that we can talk about. Okay? So I've broken it down here. We're going to go through two of each of the sub-arguments. You're welcome to ask me questions along the way. So the first argument, I should say this is called a cosmological argument. So what do I mean by that? Cosmological arguments generally take a generic feature of the universe and say something needs to explain this. And then they go and look for that explanation, and they argue that such an explanation must be something like God. Okay? So in this case, it's the idea that things around us begin to exist, right? Like a chair comes into existence, a human being comes into existence, a squirrel, planets, black holes, galaxies, they all come into existence according to our best understanding of what's going on. And so now we make the claim, or maybe everything that begins to exist has a cause. Seems like a reasonable thing. So how might we argue for this? Well, a common strategy in cosmological arguments is what's called an inexplicability argument. Okay? So with an inexplicability argument, you're basically saying, well, what if this wasn't true? So just think about the world if the first premise was not true. Okay? It would mean that things can begin to exist without being caused. They can just pop into existence from nothing. Right? But if that's the case, then an inexplicability argument says, well, but then it would be difficult to explain why anything and everything doesn't just pop into existence all the time. Right? If things aren't constrained from coming into existence out of nothing, then why don't they just do that all the time? Does that kind of make sense? It's like if you deny this, you're kind of making the world way more mysterious and unexplainable than it was a second ago. But if you assume this, you say, yes, whatever begins to exist does need a cause, it's very easy to explain this. The reason a horse didn't pop into existence right here, right now, is because there was no cause to bring the horse into existence here, right now. Right? Pretty simple. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's a pretty common strategy. Obviously, the exact way you frame the inexplicability argument will depend on what your premise looks like. In this case, we're talking about things beginning to exist and having causes. There could be other ways of framing that, but that's how it works in this case. Now, let me give you an example of how someone might respond to this. They might say, well, maybe it's not in the nature of horses to come into existence out of nothing. And it's not in the nature of bicycles and in the nature of, flowers to come into existence out of nothing. But it is in the nature of universes to come into existence out of nothing. Right? Because that's what this person believes. Maybe they were taught this in high school or something, that the universe popped into existence at the Big Bang out of nothing. How might you respond to that?
Well, would it be exceptional to everything else?
That's a great point. Why would the universe be different from everyone else, everything else? Like, what is it about universes that's particularly unique that would make it so special? They've kind of just added one mystery next to the previous mystery. They haven't really kind of actually explained anything. Another thing you could say is, well, I don't see universes pop into existence everywhere, right? It doesn't. I use the example of a horse popping into existence here, but like, why doesn't a universe pop into existence here, right? Like, it's like you could even grant what they're saying. You could say, yeah, sure, maybe it's just universes. You could also say, well, the nature of a thing does govern what it can and can't do. That's true, right? So like a squirrel can't have a conversation about philosophy, right? A rock can't breathe, right? The nature of a thing does affect what it can and can't do. But the thing has to exist first before its nature can do any work, right? A squirrel, you can't say a non-existent squirrel is irrational. It doesn't, like, it's nothing. A non-existent squirrel isn't rational or irrational. It's just non-existent. And so a horse's nature could only start doing things once the horse exists. But it's the horse coming into existence is the thing that we're talking about in the first place. So you can't really invoke its nature to do any explaining work. Does that kind of make sense? They're kind of getting the reasoning backwards. Okay. Another reason we might, so now that was sort of a explanatory, kind of talking about the explanatory power of a particular assumption, of one assumption or its negation. And the assumption that whatever begins to exist has a cause is much better at explaining our existence and everyday life than its negation. So you say, okay, well, we should believe that then, right? That's a pretty reasonable way to do it. Another way you could do it is less deductive. It's more inductive. I'm not going to explain what that is. But basically, we could say, well, look, I mean, everything that we can ever observe has a cause when it comes into existence, right? So I know people, things, and animals and plants, everything in the world. I can always reasonably say, what caused this thing to come into existence? And I could go find it, and then I will find it. And every time human beings have gone and looked for that thing, they have gone and found it, right? It's happened not just for things that we can touch and see and smell. It's happened for particles, right? We've postulated all sorts of weird particles like quarks and virtual particles and bosons and all these sorts of things that we can't directly see and touch, and yet every single one of them has a cause for its coming into existence. It's applied to something as abstract as space-time curvature in physics, right? Like, how does gravity work? That even has a cause. When something starts to pull on one thing, it has a cause. It happens to massive things like black holes and galaxies and quasars. Each of these things, if you go ask the relevant scientist, what caused this thing to begin to exist, they will have a ready answer for you. That's pretty much like their whole job, is trying to figure out what caused this thing to begin to exist. And so you might say, okay, well, maybe we don't know for sure that it's true, that everything that begins to exist has a cause, but it's literally confirmed by every single time we could have checked it. So it seems reasonable to assume that it's true in general, especially when we're talking about a universe, which is basically just the combination of all the things we were just talking about. Like, it's not that different. Maybe if we were talking about like the existence of a spiritual being, it would be a bit different. But we're talking about a physical thing coming into existence, and every physical thing that comes into existence has a cause. That's pretty reasonable to assume. You can be like, I think this is quite reasonable. Does that make sense? Okay, so that would be the defense of the first premise. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Okay, and you could imagine yourself. You wouldn't necessarily, have a whiteboard when you're talking to your friend about this, right? It would come up in a more natural conversation. I was having a conversation with a friend from university a while ago, and he was convinced that the universe had already begun to exist. He was convinced, based on the scientific evidence, that the universe began to exist. And then he said, Christianity is not very scientific. And I was like, well, I mean, or belief in God is not very scientific. And I was like, well, I mean, it's one small step away from what you already believe, right? You just believe that I just believe that whatever begins to exist has a cause. And he tried to deny it. And then we kind of would go through these sorts of examples of what he would do. He would give some arguments, push back. And I'd be like, I mean, look, you can believe what you want to believe, but like, this is the way the evidence seems to be pointing. And this is the way that is most explanatory, most fits with the way that people generally think about things. In the end, he ended up having to deny like time exists or something in order to, get it. Which I'm like, okay, look, you can deny time exists, that's fine, but like, I think it's reasonable to assume time exists, and I'm going to stick with my God exists conclusion then. It can just come up in a natural conversation. You don't have to like present the arguments, but kind of having a sense of like, okay, how do these things work? How do they fit together? Can be helpful. Okay. What about this idea that the universe began to exist? That's pretty well established today, actually, pretty well established scientific fact. Back in the day, like before the 20th century, it was actually commonly assumed that the universe did not begin to exist, or at least that we couldn't demonstrate it scientifically, right? So kind of the idea was the universe has always been the same size, and it's kind of just gone as far back as we can. It's gone back infinitely, or atheists would think it's gone back infinitely. Christians would say, well, at some point God created it, but they agreed that it was more or less static in its size going back, and kind of God just started it at some point. Then in the 20th century, early 20th century, we made a bunch of scientific discoveries that the universe was inflating. It was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It was getting further and further away. It was like spreading out. And so we extrapolated backwards, and we're like, well, if it's been spreading out, then at some point, if we go backwards in time, it would have all been at one point. It can't just keep going back indefinitely, which is quite uncomfortable for the prevailing sentimentality at the time, but it's only been more and more confirmed by various scientific discoveries. And I'm not going to go through them now, but if you want to talk about that afterwards, you want to ask me about that, even in the Q&A section afterwards, I'm happy to give you a bit of a history lesson there. But yeah, it's very interesting. So we got things like general relativity. We discovered redshift, which you might have remember from your Doppler effect lectures at high school. And we've also observed what's called the microwave background radiation of the universe, which was a huge confirmation that the universe was expanding even faster in the early stages of its life than it is now. It's sort of like slowing down. So generally speaking, when you talk to someone who considers themselves scientifically literate, they will accept the Big Bang, because that's what they were taught in school. That's what most scientists believe is the case, and we just keep finding more and more confirmation of that as we go. And so it's usually quite an easy bit to argue for. What they were usually taught, though, is that it came into existence without a cause. It just popped into existence randomly, right? And that's where we would then go back to the first premise and explain why it doesn't really make much sense. It's not as that is not what the scientific evidence points towards. The scientific evidence just points towards the fact that the universe began. It doesn't really get into the explaining of how it began. But we can say, well, things begin to exist, they have a cause. There must be a cause for the universe. 2 and 2, 4. Now, people believe, so I mentioned, you might have, if you're thinking about the timeline, you might think, well, hang on a second. You told me that this argument started in like early medieval time, but we only discovered the expansion in the beginning of the universe in the 19th century, or the 20th century. So what about all that? What about the intervening millennium of time between these two things? We had to rely on philosophical arguments that an infinite past is not really a coherent idea. Okay, so there's different arguments have been given. There's a whole group of arguments that are based around the idea of a paradox, right? So it's like if you assume that the past is infinite, that there was no beginning, then some paradox follows, and because the paradox can't be true, therefore it must be impossible for it to have been infinite. It's sort of like how you might, I don't know if everyone is as into time travel as I am, but sort of how people sometimes reason against time travel, right? They say, well, if you could time travel, then you could go back and kill your grandfather. But if you killed your grandfather, you would never exist to go time travel, which is kind of a contradiction. Therefore, time travel must be impossible. Or at least that version of time travel must be impossible. You must go to like a parallel timeline that like splits off, or you go to like an alternate universe or something like that, right? It's a similar sort of thing. It's like, well, if the age of the universe is infinite, so I can prove some paradox. Because some paradox is impossible, therefore the age of the universe must not be infinite. Okay? So there's lots of these ones. There's something called the Tristram-Shandy paradox, which is awesome, which I will not get into. There's the Hilbert-Hotel paradox, and there's the one I'm going to talk to you about today, which is more recent in the literature. It's called the Grim Reaper paradox, which is a cool name. I mostly chose this one because it's a cool name. I could have chosen any of them to talk about, but I like this one. Okay. So in the Grim Reaper paradox, we first have to set up a Grim Reaper scenario. It's sort of the equivalent of setting up a killing your grandfather scenario in the argument, okay? So here's the scenario. There are infinitely many Grim Reapers, and each one is assigned a particular, let's say, day, or a particular minute, or a particular whatever, okay? Now, we're assuming that the past is infinite. So that means that we can assign infinitely many Grim Reapers to each day going back as far back as we want, right? There's no like first one, just like there's no first day. Okay, so that's the first step of the scenario. The second step of the scenario is that these Grim Reapers follow a rule. At each at each Grim Reaper's allocated time, they will wake up, or I don't know, they'll get off their chair or stop being lazy, whatever, and they will kill Bob if he isn't already dead. I have to add that if he isn't already dead yet, but just to be technically correct, but I mean, obviously Bob's not going to die more than once, so like, they're going to kill Bob and Bob's going to be dead, okay? That's it. That's the scenario. We have infinitely many days going into the past, the Grim Reaper is assigned to each day, and at each Grim Reaper's day, it will wake up and kill Bob if Bob is not already dead. Okay? From this, we can derive two incompatible conclusions. So this is if you've heard of this term, this is a philosophical thought experiment, right? This is what we're busy engaging in, right? On the first result is this, that Bob is killed. So by the time we get to today, Bob is dead. That seems like a reasonable assumption, right? Presumably, yesterday, if Bob was still alive, the Grim Reaper for yesterday would have woken up and killed Bob by then, right? And you could pick any day you want. The Grim Reaper would have killed him by that point. Okay. So Bob is definitely dead by today. Okay. The second result, however, is that none of the Grim Reapers kills Bob. Now, how do we prove this? Well, this is where the infinite regress comes in. The problem with infinities comes in. Pick any day you want, like last Tuesday, or 3 years ago on a Monday, on the 1st of April, or like whatever day you want, right? You can ask yourself the question, did that Grim Reaper kill Bob? And the answer would be no. Because the Grim Reaper the day before would have had a chance to kill Bob, and they would have killed him. So he would have already been dead, and so the Grim Reaper you were thinking about didn't kill Bob. But you could run that argument for every single Grim Reaper, because there isn't a first Grim Reaper who doesn't have a person before them, a Grim Reaper before them, right? So no Grim Reaper can kill Bob, because at any given point that a Grim Reaper would kill Bob, another one's already killed him. Okay, so now we have two facts that can't both be true. Bob was killed, and Bob was not killed, right? This is sort of like you killed your grandfather, but you wouldn't have been around if your grandfather wasn't around in the first place, right? We've created a paradox. And so given this scenario, this paradoxical Grim Reaper scenario, we have this argument, right? A Grim Reaper scenario is impossible. That is a Grim Reaper where we have infinitely Grim Reapers assigning them to each a day. But if the infinite past is possible, then a Grim Reaper scenario is possible, because then we could just get an infinite number of Grim Reapers, assign them to each day, and create the scenario. Therefore, an infinite past is not possible, or is impossible. Yep. Yeah. Does that make sense? It's sort of like, it's the same as the time travel argument, right? It's like, if I could time travel according to this set of rules, I could kill my grandfather, but it's not possible for me to have killed my grandfather, because then I wouldn't be around to kill my grandfather. Therefore, a certain version of time travel is not possible. It's the same sort of logic. Does it make sense?
So like, with this infinite regress argument,
Yes.
so you say, someone says, well, like I look at the Big Bang, and you kind of go, okay, well, what caused the Big Bang? And then they might give a cosmological, we don't know, but there probably was at some point maybe the theory of like, at one point there was an expanded universe, that universe collapsed on itself. That's the
Yes.
from the Big Bang.
Yep.
That infinite regress then is, you're not talking about, to use this language, this timeline,
Yeah.
this universe. It's like,
Any timeline.
which
Yeah.
universe,
Yeah.
it
If
has
one-
to have an original start at some point.
100%.
that
Yeah.
has
So
a cause.
So when people present that kind of, there's these different models that talk about like expanding and contracting universes that kind of go in cycles. You could either go, if you're very scientific and have done a bunch of research into it, you could explain why that's been rejected by cosmologists today. But you could also present a philosophical argument like this, and it doesn't really matter what the physics of it is. It's like you can't go back infinitely. It doesn't matter what you're doing in that infinite timeline. You just can't go back infinitely. There has to be a beginning point somewhere, or somewhen. Yeah. Okay. So that's the basic way you might argue. So we've argued now whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Space and time need to have started at some point, and therefore the universe must have a cause. Now this isn't it, right? This isn't the whole thing. This is sort of half the way there, in a sense, if you think about it, right? Like we have a cause of the universe. That's already kind of atheism is sort of out the picture in that sense. But we kind of want to know, is this cause of the universe anything like God? Right, the God that we know from the Bible. And I'm not going to go into it, but basically with the cosmological argument, you have this first stage where you establish some unique being, in this case, the cause of the universe, the cause of all space and time. And then, in the second stage, you reason about what kinds of properties does this being need to have in order to be the special kind of being, in order to be the cause of the universe. So, to give some examples, this being needs to be outside of time, because he created time. This being needs to be immaterial, because he created everything that's material. This being needs to presumably be very powerful because he's creating all of this stuff from no existing material before him, right? Like when I create a chair, I'm using I'm using some existing wood. This being is like, oh, I don't have any existing wood, I just got myself. Boom, here we go, here it is, kind of thing, right? That's a pretty big deal. More sophisticated arguments could even argue that this being must be a mind with free will, but that would take us too long to get through, so I'm not going to do that. But that is covered in the On God book that I mentioned. So if you're curious about how one might go about that sort of argument, again, I recommend that you get the book. I will always recommend that you get the book. Sound good? Okay. So that's all I have for natural theology. Any questions? Make sense? Hopefully it makes some sense.
Would you say, like, would you ask one of the people you're talking to?
Yeah.
Well, you also have faith in this. The thing
Yes.
that you're saying
Yes.
is happening or did happen.
Yeah.
You also have faith in
Also, I think you can personally know this being this causing the universe. Yeah. So this is where that distinction that I mentioned at the beginning between theism, religion, bare Christianity, and fully clothed Christianity comes in, right? Like we've only got to theism at this point, right? We haven't argued that this being cares for us or loves us or anything like that, and maybe we can't from this particular argument. That's okay. The argument is just one step in a chain of reasoning that might get us to God's to the God of the Bible, right? But it's quite helpful to think about it like this. It's like, okay, we're going to talk about the resurrection now, right? It's a lot easier to believe that God rose Jesus from the dead if you already believe that an all-powerful God exists, right? It's because now you're not trying to establish that he exists from the historical evidence. You're just trying to establish what this creator of the universe did, which is a much smaller thing to need to prove, right? And so it's part of what you could call a cumulative case for Christianity, where you have different pieces, and it's entirely dependent upon where the person is. Like maybe the person already believes that God exists. We don't have to talk about an argument for God's existence. You could just go straight into talking about the resurrection and Jesus' the self-understanding. But if they, are so far gone, that's quite a strong way to say it, but so far gone that they don't even believe that God exists, then you first have to kind of bring them, one step closer, and then you can build on top of that. Does that? Yeah. You want to ask a question?
I'm thinking about this argument and how you say it needs the person to at least be there, like theism, right?
Sorry, say again?
Just to believe that God exists.
Yes.
Personally.
Yeah.
But if you say whatever begins to exist has a cause, how do you deal with them shifting the goalpost about the existence of God and stuff? Like what caused that? What caused it?
Right. So this is where so different cosmological arguments will have different answers to this question, right? It depends on what that first principle is. In this case, we've already deduced that, well, because time itself was caused by this being, it's outside of time. Therefore, it didn't begin to exist. And so it doesn't need a cause. If you're outside of time, right, you neither begin nor end.
Okay.
Right? You just are. But so then that means that it's not applicable to this first premise is not applicable to it because it didn't begin to exist, so we don't need a cause for it, right? This is sort of how atheists used to think about the universe. When they back in the day, when they thought that the universe didn't begin to exist, it just went back infinitely. They were like, therefore it doesn't need a cause. It's like, okay, well, we have good philosophical and scientific reasons for thinking the universe did exist, so therefore there needs to be something outside the universe that did the causing. But since it's outside the universe, it didn't begin to exist. It definitely didn't begin to exist because it's not even in time. Therefore, it doesn't need a cause. Right? So they're trying to, and it's a good thing for them to do, right? You don't want to state this, for instance, that everything has a cause. Everything that exists has a cause. You don't want to say that because we don't believe that, right? We believe God exists and he doesn't have a cause. So you want to, the premise is carefully constructed to just focus on exactly why we think that thing would need a cause. And then whatever that's true would not be true of God. Sorry, that's a weird way of saying it, but that's sort of yeah.
Jude and like for the empirical confirmations, almost like
That would be a great example. Yeah, like if something came into existence out of nothing, that would be a perfect example of energy coming into existence. Yeah. Or the second law of thermodynamics is another thing that people talk about, where generally speaking, energy is dissipating more and more as time goes on. And so if the universe were infinite, it would have already dissipated entirely. Yeah, things like that. Yeah. So you could appeal to very common scientific principles that, I mean, we take for granted now, but were massive scientific discoveries in their day, as further confirmation or further ways of helping a person come to terms with this idea that, yeah, maybe the universe does have a cause after all. Was there another question? I think I saw a hand this side, no?
So the Linkways question, there's some things like people moving the goalposts or asking like a question that seems like a paradox.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily mean there are paradoxes in the Christian faith, but they're not the same as other paradoxes because the nature of them is different. Because you're speaking about God.
Yeah, we use paradox in a technical way in this argument, whereas so paradox more generally can just be like a puzzling pair of statements, right? But there's not necessarily any contradiction between them. Yeah. Whereas here we're saying, no, there's something like unintelligible or problematic with these two things being true that you can't escape. So in the particular case with the Grim Reaper scenario, we proved opposites, right? So it's actually a contradiction. It's not just a paradox. So there's a looser way of speaking about paradox. You can say something is paradoxical because it's mysterious or confusing or difficult to understand. That's not what we're interested in here. We're interested in like something that we're sure isn't true. Yes?
Could it like simplified example like explaining to someone that has done this debate with you about now if the universe has a cause? Something as simple as maybe like explain now how like a child come into the world.
Mm-hmm.
Now how is a child created? Like you weren't just now you there. It's man and woman had to like come together to now create.
Yeah, you can talk about the series of events that led up to that moment. Exactly. Yeah. Yep. Cool. Okay. Now, remember I said there's two aspects of this. So there's natural theology. Now we're going to move to Christian evidences, where we're talking about specific Christian claims. So the first argument was philosophical and scientific. This argument is historical. So we're kind of shifting gears. And part of what you're going to see in this lesson is like the different sorts of ways that one can form arguments. So I had that huge list of philosophical arguments. All of them work differently, right? It's wonderful and lots of fun if you're into that kind of stuff, but I'm just trying to highlight these differences so you can kind of get a feel for them. So when we're dealing with historical arguments, we're doing what's called inference of the best explanation, okay? It's a fancy way of saying we collect a bunch of facts, right, that we can establish, historical facts, that, you know, in this case, we're going to establish a number of historical facts surrounding Jesus' death and resurrection. Well, a number of facts surrounding Jesus' death and the events that followed, whatever they were, right? Because we're not going to assume on the outset that Jesus rose from the dead. We're trying to show that. Then we're going to argue that the resurrection is the best explanation for those facts. So there might be a bunch of competing explanations, but they're all going to fail on one or two hurdles, whereas the resurrection is going to like tick all the boxes and do the best job of explaining it. This is often how we do things in history, because in history we don't always have, it's not like we have a VCR recording. That's a very dated thing. A DVD recording? We don't have iPhones where we're recording what happened. We have documents and archaeological evidence and whatever, and we kind of have to say, okay, well, what was the one thing that explained all of these pieces of evidence that we have? Right? This is just about anything in history. And then so we accumulate the pieces of evidence that we have, we argue that they must be related somehow, and then we talk about different things that could have happened that would have explained all the evidence that we see. Right? We're doing the same thing, straightforward thing with the resurrection. So there are different versions of the argument I'm going to talk to you about tonight. We're going to go with William Lane Craig's version because it's the version found in the book, and I figured it would be helpful for you to, if you're going to go read something, you read kind of the same thing that we went through in the lesson. But there's different versions, and most of the time they differ. They actually differ on both stages. So they differ on the facts that they pick out, and then they differ about how they argue that the resurrection is the best explanation. But all of them follow the same basic pattern. Establish a bunch of facts, argue that the resurrection is the best explanation. Okay, so in William Lane Craig's case, we have three facts we want to show. We want to show that there was an empty tomb. I'll state all of these a bit more lengthy in a second, but there was an empty tomb. There were what are called postmortem appearances, which is the scholarly way or the academic way of talking about these appearances to the disciples. The disciples thought that they saw Jesus after he died. And then the origin of the Christian faith, which is to say a bunch of Jewish men started believing that the Messiah had just died and risen again, which is kind of a weird thing, which we'll get into in a second. But these are the three things that we're going to argue for from history. Now, what might surprise you is that we're going to use the books of the New Testament to argue for this, right? Which might seem like it's assuming what we're trying to show in the first place. But I will say that sometimes people have a problem with this generally, but this is not how historians think about it, right? Like, a non-Christian might say, well, you can't use the books of the New Testament because they're biased. Well, every single piece of history ever written is biased in very clear ways, right? I mean, even some of the historians even know that they're doing this. They say, my job is to write stories, not histories, right? He's not just writing what happened, he's trying to tell you why it was important and what happened, okay? So the fact that the New Testament is biased in some sense, like they were writing as Christians, isn't really a problem. In fact, it's often you will use the biases that are present in a piece of a manuscript or an author to make your case. So biases can actually be quite useful. They're also the earliest documents we have about Jesus and the events that happened afterwards. We have other documents outside of the New Testament, but they will come later. And so why would we use later documents when we can use earlier documents? Now, for the sake of the argument, now we're going to come back. I want to cover something we covered last week, but just clarify it a bit. For the sake of the argument, then, we're not going to assume that the books that we have in the New Testament are divinely inspired, but they're not inerrant. We're going to treat them as if they were normal documents written by people with biases in the first century. Okay? We don't believe that that's true, right? Like, if that's how we start out when we're trying to show someone who's skeptical of this stuff, right? We don't want to assume everything and then it's cheating, right? So we want to treat it like as if it was any kind of history and just show, look, a normal historical investigation is enough to establish that Jesus died and rose again from the dead, which is pretty cool. Once people are on board with that, that's why we're talking about bare Christianity, right? Like the bare minimum. Then we can talk about things like, well, were these documents divinely inspired? What does that mean? Are there errors in these documents, or did God protect the people from those errors in various ways throughout the writing of it, right? Those would be later fully clothed ideas that you have about the Bible. So we're not denying that those things are true. They are true, but for the sake of the argument, we're not assuming them. Does that make sense? Okay. If you have questions about, I know Lily, you might have some questions about how they're true. Feel free to write them down, and we'll talk about them on the last week. Happy to talk about that. Okay, so let's get through some of this. So the first claim is that Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his woman followers just after his. So his death. Maybe you would have an extra fact about the fact that he was crucified and died. We could add that. We're not going to talk about that. We're going to assume that that's an established historical fact. But you could equally do what we're doing here with that fact as well. We don't have time, right? So that's what we're going to do. Okay. So here's it's kind of like you should think about what we're going to do now as like a court case, right? We are after the fact trying to establish certain facts about the events that surrounded Jesus's death in the days that followed, right? And so we're trying to be like a good prosecutor or a good defender. I don't know which side of the court case we're on. And so I'm not going to go through all of these. They are all discussed in the book, On Guard by William Lane Craig. Get the book. I'm sponsored by him, just by the way. So I'll focus on a few of these so we can kind of see how you would reason about these. Okay, so the first one I want to focus on is this one, that one of the pieces of evidence is that the discovery of the empty tomb was, at least in the stories that we have in the Gospels, is described as being discovered by women. And they're the ones who tell the disciples, well, first they're pretty freaked out, but then eventually they go tell the disciples, and then everything sort of kicks off. Now, why would I be singling out women here as, I guess it's kind of on the board. Don't look at the board. Don't look at the screen. Why am I singling out women here as a relevant piece of information? Amali.
Would have been very unlikely that women would have been believed in that time period, I
Right. Yeah, exactly. So if we were making up the story, women would be the last people we would make up as the first witnesses, because women weren't really considered credible witnesses in the first century. Okay, I don't believe that. Okay, I just want to be very clear. I don't believe that. But that was a pretty prevailing idea. So if you're going to try and make up a story that's convincing to the people around you, you're not going to make it up in the most embarrassing way possible. Right? Generally speaking, that's not how humans operate. Also, it's not if you want to convince people of what you believe. That's not how you go about it. So here's a quote from Josephus, who's a Jewish historian in the first century. He said, "Let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex." Right? Not mincing any words. He would be cancelled in a second if that was a tweet today, right? Like crazy. Anyway, other quotes that I thought I could share was there was a rabbinical text around the time that said, "Sooner let the words of the law be burnt than delivered to women." And then another one, "Happy is he whose children are male, but unhappy is he whose children are female." So really great upholding of women in the first century there. But the point is, if you're a guy in the first century trying to make up a story about the guy you were just following who died on the cross, you are not going to make the first witnesses women. That's like the worst idea in the world, right? And so it's a pretty good sort of piece of evidence that it is in fact true that Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his word followers. Okay, another piece of evidence in favor of this is that we have multiple early independent sources. Why is that significant in a court case? Why is it significant to have multiple independent early sources?
Because they might all tell us like a different story.
Right. If they were making things up, it's unlikely that they would all agree with one another. And it's weird, like, if they're independent, then we think that they're less likely to be colluding with one another. And if they're early, it's less likely that they're making stuff up, because the people around the time that could just confirm what they're saying are still there. They can be like, "No, that's a lie. What are you guys talking about?" Right? So we have lots of independent witnesses or sources. In fact, the way that we do this is we being historians, I'm not a historian, human beings, historians in the human being field, no, other way around, human beings in the historian field, we will try and figure out the sources that underlie the texts of the New Testament. Now that might be a bit weird for you to hear, but as we have repeated, as is definitely true, God works through normal human means to write the Bible, and so that includes like interviewing people and collecting sources and doing all these sorts of things, right? So, for example, there's the creed in 1 Corinthians 15 that Paul is saying that is a creed, so, pretty good. He's talking about a creed where he said, "I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas," that is Peter, and then to the 12. So that bold bit is the creed that is it doesn't fit with the way Paul usually speaks. So we're pretty convinced as human beings that he is citing a creed or an established formula that had been around for a while. And then he adds on the end of that, he kind of adds himself to the end of that, and now we get back to normal Paul way of speaking. And by normal, I mean like in the Greek in terms of the kinds of words you use, the kind of sentence structure you use, and so on. Okay. So this is quite significant because this creed also comes from one of the earliest letters in the New Testament, right? And so it has to predate one of the earliest letters in the New Testament. And based on a bunch of factors, we think that the creed arose very early, within 5 years of Jesus' death, and it probably arises out of Jerusalem. I'm not going to get into how historians argue for that. Some people will spend like an entire PhD thesis looking at like 4 verses and trying to reason about the historical basis, but that's basically it. So that's one sort of claim, right? That or one sort of piece of evidence that this would have been the case. Other cases there, which I'm not going to go into, are Mark's source. So the end of Mark's gospel, if you read Mark's gospel, it's very like how could you say like this scene, and then he jumps to another scene, then he jumps to another scene, then he jumps to another scene, until you get to chapter 14. Where then it just becomes this like one big continuous like one shot, like in those things, right? It's very strange, like it's super different. And so that makes people think that Mark used a particular source for chapters 14 to 16 of his gospel. And then based on how it talks about the high priest and the days of the week, we dated quite early, within 10 years of Jesus' resurrection, Jesus' death, and probably coming from Jerusalem somewhere. Matthew, we know he has an additional source he is an additional source, I should say, because he includes extra details that aren't in some of the other sources. John is generally understood to be a completely different source from the other three Gospels. And then we have a bunch of sermons and Acts that also corroborate what is being said in these sources, right? So we have multiple separate lines of evidence, all talking about there being an empty tomb that was discovered by his own followers. Okay. Then finally, we also have the early Jewish response, so which gets recorded for us in Matthew. So you can see this, for instance, the disciples, they eventually get convinced that Jesus is risen from the dead after having a bit of a stumble, and then we have the guard. Oh, actually, not the disciples. Sorry, the guard going around and telling everyone, "Oh, wait, hang on, something's gone wrong here. Something is weird, right?" And then the elders and the council, who are not huge fans of Jesus because they got him killed, they start to spread a different rumor to explain what's happened, right? They say, tell the people, his disciples came by night and stole away the body while we were asleep. And then Matthew points out, and this story has spread among the Jews to this day. Right, so he's talking to people who have heard the story and all that kind of stuff. But notice, what's interesting about this is that this explanation from the Jewish Sanhedrin assumes that the tomb was empty. Right? If you don't agree that the tomb is empty, then why do you need to explain that his disciples stole the body? So the very sort of response from the opponents agrees with what we're saying, that the tomb was in fact empty after he died. They're disagreeing about the explanation for that, but we're going to get to that later. Okay, so like in a court case, you would go through these different lines of evidence for the claim that you want to establish, right? So we've got other ones there that I haven't gone through, but actually let me just give you an example. So I said there's simplicity of Mark's account. You might think, well, that's a weird thing to point out. Like, why would you consider that evidence? Well, if you look at the first accounts that were made up, so they come early 2nd century in the Gnostic Gospels, they are crazy, right? So in the one, I think it's the Gospel of Peter, not really the Gospel of Peter, but it's called the Gospel of Peter. You have Jesus come out and he's so big that his head is above the clouds. And you have the cross come out after him from the tomb and he's singing like, glory, glory, glory to God in the highest. He's risen Jesus from the dead or something. You'd be like, what are you on, bro? Like, what is this trip that you guys are on? Whereas Mark, actually, we don't even, it's a pretty lucid account of what happened, right? He doesn't even tell us about the events that happened on the day. He just tells us about the woman who discovered it, because he wasn't there, right? He's not trying to fill in any gaps for us. He's just like, look, this is what I know. This is what happened. So things like that are earmarks of credibility in that account that you don't get in later accounts. Right. So we've got a bunch of these things. They would all together. Maybe no individual one would be enough to convince you, but when you put them all together, like in a good court case, they all give a pretty strong reason for thinking that Jesus' tomb was in fact found empty after his death by a group of one followers. Okay, how are we doing time? Okay, I'll go a bit faster with the next one because I think you kind of get the basic idea of how this works now. Okay, so the second one was what we called the postmortem appearances. What I mean by this is on numerous occasions and in different places, various individuals and groups saw appearances of Jesus alive from the dead. So in this claim, we're not trying to say that Jesus was in fact alive from the dead, because remember, that's the very thing that we're trying to argue for. We're just saying that some people saw him. They maybe had like a vision of some kind, or they tripped out, or like something like that, right? Maybe there was grief. We don't know. The explanation is yet to be given. The point is they claimed to have in fact seen Jesus risen from the dead. Okay, so here we have similar. Do I need? No, I don't need to go through that. So once again, we have the woman of the Gospels. So we've already described what's going on there. We have multiple sources for that. So we have John and Matthew, who are typically understood to be separate sources. And then we have the same point about woman being of low standing. in that scenario. So again, if you're going to make up the story, why would you make it up with women being the first witnesses? It'd be interesting to know what, if you were going to make it up today, how that would be different. But, whatever. Then we have evidence that Peter also experienced Jesus like this. So we have the 1 Corinthians 15 creed. We have the account of Luke in Luke's gospel. And we have the account of Paul in his letters, like in Galatians, that Peter has, in fact, gone through this experience. We also have James. This is quite an interesting one. James, the brother of Jesus. This is mentioned in the 1 Corinthians 15 creed, and it also fits with circumstantial evidence, which is a term you would have heard from a crime drama. So we have James. He, in the Gospels, rejects Jesus, right? He thinks Jesus is crazy, along with all of Jesus' brothers. But then by the time we get to Acts 15, he's like this head honcho in the church, where he's making declarations at the first council of the church. And in the letter of Galatians, we learn that he was, along with Peter, one of the main guys in Jerusalem. And so that's really good circumstantial evidence that James had some kind of experience of Jesus, because it takes quite a lot for your brother, who you previously thought was crazy and then got crucified as worse than a murderer, and now you're somehow think he's God, right? What what kind of experience does that needs to happen for that to sort of occur, right? So we're told that James had this vision, and then the circumstantial evidence around it fits really well with that. Okay, so we have the same for other people like Paul himself, or the apostles, the 12, and so on. And something that's quite important to note here is that the appearances I could describe for us are physical in nature, and this is quite a weird thing that will I get back to in a second? Yeah, don't know. No, I don't know. I don't know if I'll get back to that in a second. I was going to say I'll get back to it in a second, but I'm not sure. But the main point is that there's various reasons for thinking that the sort of visions that these people are seeing are of Jesus being physical. They're not seeing if you can imagine the visions that you get in the Old Testament, like where Ezekiel sees God. Ezekiel or Isaiah see God, and it's quite like a kind of a crazy picture. Or Ezekiel sees God in a crazy picture where he's got animals that are weirdly designed and all these sorts of things. Nothing like that. A lot of the descriptions that we get are pretty mundane. Like he's walking and talking to them. He's like, shake my hands, all that kind of stuff. That's quite an important feature to keep in mind about these. But we'll see why in a bit. And then finally, we have the last line of evidence that I want to talk about, which is that Jesus' earliest disciples believed that God had raised him bodily from the dead. Okay? So what I mean by this is that they sincerely believed it. They weren't just making this up. And so we have various reasons for believing that they sincerely believed it. I'm not going to go through everything, but for example, some of the early church fathers who follow after the disciples, like Clement, he was mentioned in one of the letters. He's a friend of Paul. And Polycarp, who was the disciple of John, they talk about the sincerity of believing and how they went to their death for it. We also have this idea that this belief in God raising Jesus bodily from the dead doesn't really fit with anything in pre-existing Jewish beliefs, right? So it's true that Jesus died and rose in accordance with the scriptures, but the scriptures and the Jewish expectations of the first century are not that the Messiah rises ahead of everyone else at the end of the generation. Where they the way that we would, if you just had the Old Testament, the way that you would think it would happen was the Messiah comes and he starts the new age and ends the old age, and everyone has the general resurrection in one go. This idea of, firstly, a dying Messiah, pretty strange. Certainly no one in the first century had that idea, which we see the disciples really struggle with in the Gospels. But also the idea that there would be a pre-general resurrection of just the Messiah ahead of everyone else doesn't have any place in Jewish theology at that point. And so the idea that they're lying and making this up isn't very credible, because it's like, well, where would they have made it up, and why would they make this up in order to convince the people they didn't expect this at all? Right? You would rather them say, he's gone and conquered a bunch of Gentile nations, because that's what everyone was expecting at that time. Okay. So these are the three facts summarized: that Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers; that on numerous occasions and in different places, various individuals and groups saw appearances of Jesus alive from the dead; and that Jesus' earliest disciples believed that God had raised him bodily from the dead. So these are the facts. And now we want to talk about an explanation. So a bunch of explanations have been given over the centuries, right? People are quite obstinate in not wanting to believe in Christianity. We're just going to talk about, maybe we'll just talk about one or two of them. Oh, we'll talk about these three. Okay, so the conspiracy theory says that the disciples stole the body and lied about the appearances, right? So now what you would do is you would say, okay, well, is this a good explanation? Is it not a good explanation? You want to try and poke holes in this to explain why it's problematic, given what we've already looked at. Yeah. So, for example, we've already discussed that, well, if they're going to make this up, if they're going to lie about these things, they did it in the most surprising and stupid way that they could possibly think of, right? They made women the first witnesses, which isn't a very credible way to go. They gave no description of the resurrection itself, which, interestingly, you do see in the first Gospels that we think were made up, like later. They start talking about the resurrection itself. And they can't really point to like super clear-cut case. Like they're talking to people who don't expect this of the Messiah. So they're making up a story they're making up the story about the Messiah that no one is expecting, right? It's sort of just not a really good way of doing it. It also doesn't really account for all of the appearances that we see. So we have people who were fans of Jesus, believing him, but then we also have people that weren't necessarily fans of Jesus, believing in him, like the 500 that I mentioned in 1 Corinthians, the broader set of apostles, by which I mean not the disciples that were with him, but the people around him. We have Paul, who was a murderer of people in the church, and we have James, who was a skeptic of Jesus. Right? These aren't people that were predisposed to buying into any kind of conspiracy theory. So somehow these guys got them bought in. Yeah. And then we could talk about a bunch of things, right? There's no motive for them to lie. So you think of means, motive, and opportunity. There's no real motive for them to lie. They don't really make any money being apostles. Or if they did, they kept it secret from everyone. They all died in gruesome deaths, or most of them died gruesome deaths for what they believed. So not a really great experience there. Yeah. Make sense? Right. They also described the resurrection appearances in the worst way for Jews. Like it's not what they would have made up, right? They would have expected, and sometimes this did happen. So what you would expect a Jew to say if the guy that they were following died is to say, well, he died, yes, but it was a mistake, and he was ultimately vindicated by God, and we saw him in heaven next to God in like a vision or something like that, in dazzling glory, like we see in Isaiah or Ezekiel. Not, well, actually he came back from the dead as a human, like, and walked around with us and ate with us and chatted to us. It's like, well, hang on, no one was expecting that. Like, why would you say that rather than we saw the normal vision that every Jew in the first century would be expecting? Okay. What about the claim that the disciples just hallucinated Jesus' return? Well, a big problem with this is that it doesn't explain the empty tomb, right? I mean, people could have just taken them to the tomb and be like, hey guys, the tomb, he has his body, definitely wasn't alive, you guys hallucinated. The diversity of the hallucinations is quite unbelievable as well. So let me give this quote from William O. Craig. He says, Jesus appeared not just one time, but many times, not just in one locale and circumstance, but a variety of places under a variety of circumstances. Not just to one individual, but different persons, not just to individuals, but to various groups, not to just believers, but to unbelievers and even enemies. There's nothing like the resurrection appearances in the psychological casebooks. Okay? And then finally, if they were typically, again, when you hallucinate in accordance with your beliefs already, right? Because that's what an hallucination is. It's your mind projecting what you're seeing. And again, none of these guys expected a bodily resurrection of a human being in the first century ahead of everyone else. So if they're gonna hallucinate something, that is not what they're gonna hallucinate. That's like nowhere near their minds at this point. They had to anyway. So now we compare that to the resurrection theory. God raised Jesus from the dead. Yeah. Firstly, it explains all the facts. It does so pretty well. It doesn't really require many additional beliefs either. If we already, as we said earlier, if we already believe that God exists because we've given some reason for thinking that he exists, that he's extremely powerful, that he could, raise someone from the dead, then all you really have to add to that is the belief that God decided to act in a particular way in history. Which, is that probable, improbable? I don't know. Depends what God is like. And so it's much better than the competing explanations for the facts that we've been looking at. So that would be That gives you an idea of how you might go about giving a resurrection defense. Again, as we speak about in Apologetics, or as I've mentioned a few times, you wouldn't really get a chance. I mean, sometimes you can, but most of the time you don't really get a chance to sit down and take someone through the full case, right? Sometimes you do get that chance, right? And that's great. Take the chance. Take the opportunity. Pray about it, but take the opportunity. But like a lot of the time, people will just be skeptical about something, right? And if you're kind of familiar with reasons for accepting something or not, like someone could say, yeah, but they just stole his body. And then it's like, okay, well, let's think about that. Like, what does that mean about how you would think about this historically? A lot of the time, getting one or two like responses in to someone who's skeptical about the historical evidence gets them to start thinking about Christianity as an historical event, rather than as a private, sort of privately held feeling or experience, like your taste in chocolate or your favorite movie or something like that. And then often they will go and do the investigation themselves. They'll ask you for a book, or they'll get you to sit down or something like that to go further if they're interested. Sometimes they'll just stop it off and move on with their life. That's not on you. That's on them. But when they're open to it, then that's sort of a way down. So you can use the historical argument in all sorts of ways, but I think a lot of the time these days, the biggest thing is to get non-believers accustomed to the fact that Christianity makes claims that something actually happened in history, and we can use normal historical methodology to investigate that and get at it.